What's one moment that made you go, that's it, I'm done?
The toast should have been simple: a clink of glasses over a plate of grilled salmon and a small mountain of roasted potatoes, a minute of breathing after a year of grinding through performance reviews and late nights and extra projects no one wanted. Yet the moment the manager set down the champagne flutes and my partner Ryan squeezed my hand under the linen tablecloth, my mother leaned back in her chair with the kind of laugh that sounds like a door closing and said, in a voice bright enough to carry to the next booth, that I should not get too attached to those promotion checks, because a good daughter knows her brother deserves support when he is finding himself, and she delivered finding himself. Like a gift-wrapped diagnosis that explained everything from his abandoned landscaping business to the week he tried being a life coach with exactly 0 clients. I kept my smile since the room was full of soft lighting and well-dressed strangers and a pianist who seemed determined to make every melody sound hopeful, and I said that I earned this, that I worked for it, that I had planned to pay down the last of my student loans and finally replace the dishwasher that sounds like it's chewing gravel, and my mother patted my knuckles like I was listing hobbies and said family share, while my father gave the slow nod of a referee who has already decided the game, and my brother Jason smirked over his craft beer like a man watching the waiter wheel his dessert toward the table. Ryan's thumb traced a little circle on my palm to remind me to breathe. And for 1 second, I almost laughed because I could feel the script settling into the groove it always finds with us. The one where I am the reliable mule and Jason is the misunderstood visionary who keeps mistaking other people's wallets for investor confidence. The server snapped the cork, bubbles jumped, and I lifted my glass with a line I had rehearsed in the mirror, grateful, grounded, determined to make this next year count. Yet as soon as I said grateful, my mother murmured that gratitude looks best on a girl whose money knows where home is, and Jason, all casual and magnanimous, added that he was already lining up a small equipment purchase for a new venture that would absolutely blow up once he had the runway, which was a sentence constructed almost entirely out of helium. I tried to pivot to the tiny wins that make the grind bearable, the junior on my team who finally got credit for her analysis, the mentor who told me he was proud, the email from a client who said my deck made a decision easy, and while I spoke, Jason tapped his phone with the rhythm of someone placing orders, and my father, who used to lean over my algebra homework with a pencil and patience, stared at the wine bottle as if it contained weather. I could feel the room tilt toward that old familiar gravity where I shrink to fit their expectations, so I did something petty and, honestly, medicinal, because if revenge has a training mode, mine is passive-aggressive budgeting. I excused myself with a smile, drifted toward the restrooms, and, in the hallway where the framed black and white photos make every stranger look like a dignitary, I opened my banking app, turned off the automatic transfer labeled family fund that I set up years ago, when I was still buying my own thrift store suits and pretending the label did not itch, and then I added a new alert that pings me whenever any application even thinks about using my name for credit. And for a final flourish, I flicked off the small allowance I had been sending Jason on the first Monday of each month, because it was temporary, and yes, the amount would barely cover his subscription to a motivational podcast, but still. The click felt like reclaiming a room in a house I pay for. When I returned, Ryan had arranged the plates as if he were building me a defense, his pinky resting against my napkin in a quiet yes you can, and I decided to try humor, because if I cannot laugh here I will cry in the car. So I said I was absolutely open to supporting Jason's next act once a qualified adult from the bank, or a human with a calculator, confirms that his act has left the planning stage, and my mother called me dramatic. And my father sighed into a salad, and Jason, buoyed by the attention, leaned forward and told me not to worry because he had already counted on my help and had taken steps to make sure the right people understood that my new salary would keep the family moving, which he delivered with the confident grin of a man who believes the train will stop for him regardless of whether he is standing on the platform or still in bed. And while the pianist slid into another hopeful song, I felt my stomach climb toward my throat and saw Ryan's jaw tighten as if he were about to stand, and before the server could place the dessert menus, Jason raised his glass to me and said, with that same easy certainty, that some paperwork had already been submitted in my name, so everything was set, and we were all good, at least. That is what he said right before Ryan's smile changed from tender to surgical. The drive to this dinner had felt like the last mile of a marathon where the finish line keeps scooting backward. And as my mother dabbed the condensation ring her wine glass, left like it was a personal insult, while Jason narrated his next miracle pivot with the grim confidence of a man who has never once met a spreadsheet. I could feel the old rehearsal resume its march through my body, because this is how it always went when we were kids, and then when we were barely adults, and then when we were adults pretending family dynamics magically age out like bad haircuts, with Jason breaking something and my parents calling it a lesson while I learned the opposite lesson, which is that lessons seem to be expensive and always billed to me. I remembered the night of senior prom, when the boutique called to say the dress I had put on hold was sold because my card declined after I paid the registration fee for Jason's summer baseball league, and I wore a thrifted navy thing that smelled faintly of an attic while my mother told me I looked classic, and I remembered freshman year when I worked the morning shift at the coffee place before class. Then came home to find Jason teaching himself music production on a laptop I had saved for while my father said this was how entrepreneurs are made. And I remembered the afternoon my first car limped into the driveway making a sound like cutlery in a blender, and Jason admitted he had taken it for a spin around the lake because inspiration needs wind, and I paid the mechanic in installments while my mother said it built character, which is a nice way of saying you will pay twice, once in cash and again in patience. So when Jason leaned across the table now and explained that his new operation only needed a small cash advance to push inventory, and the word inventory did a lot of heavy lifting for a man whose last venture sold inspirational mugs that arrived with the quotes printed upside down, I tried to picture what my life would look like if I agreed, and I saw a rerun that never ends. The same late-night transfers, the same excuses about timing and luck, the same family text thread calling him brave. While I was useful, and something in me said no in a voice I almost did not recognize because it was quiet and sure, not dramatic, just finished. I folded my napkin the way I do when I prepare a budget, and I looked at Jason with a soft smile that is, in our family, the equivalent of a cease and desist letter, and I said that if he was building a business, we could run it like a business, and I would be delighted to provide a non-binding indication of interest once he provided a profit and loss statement, a forecast with quarterly assumptions, supplier contracts with delivery terms, and a personal guarantee that did not list my name anywhere near the signature block. Then I turned to my parents and added that we could even make this festive by setting a standing meeting where he brings updates and I bring questions, because accountability loves company. The line earned me my mother's disapproving inhale and my father's diplomatic blink, but it also earned me a few seconds of silence long enough to do what I had decided in the hallway, which was to retrieve from my bag the little folder I carry for receipts and notes and pull out 3 printed invoices I prepared last weekend after a long bath and a longer look at my financial history. Each invoice neat as a sermon and stamped with a due date set 30 days out, detailing loan 1 for the emergency phone Jason needed after he tossed his into the river during a sunset epiphany, loan 2 for the winter tires my parents bought on my card because the store did not take theirs that day, and loan 3 for the refundable deposit on a studio Jason rented to record a podcast that lasted exactly 2 episodes, with a friendly note at the bottom explaining that, in the spirit of family transparency, I would be sending these to our shared family email thread tonight, so no one would worry about my memory. And then, because humor helps medicine go down, I added a line item for emotional labor with a smiley face that would not survive later edits, but amused me now, and I slid the papers to Jason like a magician returning a borrowed coin. He stared in the manner of a man discovering paperwork has mass. My mother sputtered that I was being petty when I should be generous on a night like this, and my father muttered that this was not the time to keep score, which was a curious way to phrase the decades of scorekeeping my mother has done in her head where Jason always wins overtime, and I told them I agreed completely, that this was not about score, it was about clarity, which is a relief for everyone involved. Because once numbers Sit in the light, they stop talking and start informing, and I added that I had also contacted the 3 credit bureaus that morning after a small coincidence at work reminded me people sometimes submit forms with the wrong names. So any attempt to link my identity with an application would trigger a verification call to me, and not to the person who thinks my signature is a community resource. Jason tried a laugh that turned into a cough, and said I was overreacting to what he called routine prep. And Ryan, who had been quiet in that watchful way he has when he is building a bridge he wants me to cross by my own choice, leaned in and asked if I had the emails confirming those credit alerts, because he found the strangest thing in our mailbox today, and he would love, genuinely love, to compare dates, and then, so softly my family mistook it for tenderness, he added that the night was far from over. Ryan's tone had the calm steadiness of a person who has measured the room and chosen the right tool, yet beneath it I could hear the soft click of a lock sliding into place as he asked about the dates on my fraud alerts. And while my mother fussed with her napkin as if paper could absorb accountability, and my father examined the wine label as if it held a set of instructions for escaping a conversation, Jason leaned back with that practiced swagger that uses posture like a shield and told us all to relax because he had simply been proactive, a word he adored because it made impulsive gambles sound like leadership, and then, with a generosity that belonged to other people's pockets, he explained that a vendor required proof of family backing for a short window, which is why he had included my new salary in a few preliminary forms that were not binding, not serious, not anything to get uptight about, and he let the word uptight dangle like bait while the pianist shifted into a hopeful melody that, in this lighting, made strangers believe romance could still be negotiated by dessert. I set my glass down slowly, because my hands have always been the first to betray me, and asked Jason which vendor and which forms and where, precisely, my name had been attached, and he waved a hand in a floating gesture that means everywhere and nowhere, and said it was something like a working capital line, minimal risk, maximum flexibility, and he threw in a garland of jargon he must have collected from motivational podcasts and LinkedIn posts that treat capitalization like a sign of destiny. But when Ryan quietly slid his phone across the linen and tapped a screenshot of a mailed notice bearing my name next to a pre-approval code, the room seemed to tilt, not dramatically, just enough that I could feel the truth roll against my ankles like a tide. Because the date on the notice landed 2 days before I had even been told about my promotion, which meant the math was not a coincidence, it was a plan. My mother inhaled as if oxygen were running low and declared that families help each other without getting legal about it. My father murmured something about misunderstandings, and Jason, now shading toward annoyance, said that if I had wanted to be included, I should have been easier to include, which is a sentence that only works if you believe access to a person's identity is a favor you bestow, not a boundary you request, and I felt that quiet no rise again, steadier than before, while I remembered the thrifted prom dress, the coffee shift at dawn, the late-night spreadsheets no one saw, and I realized that the thing I had always been stingy with more than money was my willingness to occupy space at my own table. So I occupied it with a small piece of revenge disguised as good manners, because I smiled at the server, asked if the restaurant could do separate checks, and when my mother stiffened and my father frowned and Jason snorted about petty symbolism, I said that separate checks help everyone keep track of what belongs to whom, which is the policy I am adopting everywhere tonight, and then I did something that felt like opening a window in a house that had not breathed in years. I pulled out my phone, called the bank's fraud department, speaker on, voice calm, identified myself, and requested a freeze and a fraud alert escalation tied to any pre-approval code intersecting with my social and my address. While the representative asked the ritual questions, and I answered them with the serenity of a person who has finally decided to be boring and thorough. And when she asked if anyone else might be attempting to act on my behalf, I said that a relative had made an enthusiastic mistake and I wanted to ensure that enthusiasm found a better outlet, preferably far away from revolving credit. Jason muttered that I was humiliating him in public. My mother hissed that I was humiliating the family. My father pleaded for discretion. Yet the truth is that humiliation is a late fee charged by reality when you refuse to read the contract. And while the representative rattled off confirmation numbers, each one a small nail tapping into wood, I did one additional thing that felt, to me, like a practical joke aimed at fate. I asked to enroll in verbal passphrase verification that only I could provide, and then chose a phrase my family would never guess, a line from a poem I copied into my planner during a broke winter when I was learning how to be my own safety net. And when the representative repeated the passphrase back and thanked me for protecting my identity, I thanked her for giving me the kind of boundary that does not require a fight at a dinner table to enforce it. When the call ended, the silence had the texture of wool, thick and scratchy, and I filled it before my mother could, because if there is one thing I have learned about steering a ship in choppy water, it is that you do not wait for a passenger to seize the wheel. So I turned to Jason and, in the same tone I use with my team when I will not soften the truth with extra sugar, told him that any document bearing my name without my consent would meet 3 friends in quick succession: the fraud team, a lawyer whose retainer I had quietly paid last month after an uneasy dream, and a police report drafted with the clinical brevity of an annual review. And if he wanted to do something brave tonight, he could fetch the forms he had casually submitted and bring them to me, here, now, so we could evaluate together whether bravery looks better under fluorescent lights. Jason flushed a color that used to make me hand him a glass of water and a joke. My mother reached for my wrist with the reflex born of decades of redirecting me into silence, and Ryan, who had watched the whole performance with the patience of a man letting a fuse burn to its most persuasive length, pushed back his chair, reached into his bag, and placed a slender manila folder on the white tablecloth with the gentleness people reserve for expensive porcelain, then rested his palm on it as if to study the room, and said, in the tone of an accountant who has located the forgotten column, that since we were discussing clarity and dates and the difference between assumption and permission, it might be helpful to look at what had arrived at our apartment this week, addressed to me but opened by someone else, after which he lifted his hand and nudged the folder toward my parents, while Jason, suddenly very interested in the pianist's hopeful melody, failed to notice that hopeful music only distracts the audience until page 1 is read aloud. The folder did not look dramatic, a pale rectangle no thicker than a magazine, yet as my mother set her fingertips on the cardboard like someone testing the temperature of bathwater, and my father shifted in his chair as though the cushion had developed thorns, I felt the entire evening rearrange itself around that hinge, because Ryan does not bring paper to dinner unless he intends the meal to come with footnotes, and when he invited my parents to open it first for the sake of transparency, while Jason rolled his shoulders and smirked at the ceiling as if the chandelier were applauding his initiative, my mother finally slid out the stack and spread the pages the way she used to lay out report cards on the kitchen counter. Except the headings here were not honor roll commendations, but the kind of official typography that knows how to announce consequences without raising its voice. On top, clipped neatly with a receipt for certified mail and the faint stamp of our building's date machine, lay a notice from a regional lender thanking me for my early interest and inviting me to upload my pay stubs to complete pre-approval for a revolving business line. A cheery paragraph broken only by the small fact that the application had been submitted using an email address I do not own and a phone number I have never seen, followed by a set of screen captures Ryan had printed from the lender's portal that showed a document labeled Support Letter from Family Backer, whose cursive looked vaguely like mine except for the way the R dipped like it was tired. And before anybody could argue that this was all a mix-up, the next page displayed a chain of messages between Jason Operations and a vendor contact named Lenora, in which Jason stated that his sister was on board and would finalize the guarantor field after her celebration weekend, which he described with a champagne emoji. That made my molars ache, and at the bottom Ryan had highlighted the date, which sat there like a fingerprint. 2 days before my boss told me I was promoted, and 3 days before I took my mother to lunch to plan this dinner she was currently hijacking in the name of family tradition. My father cleared his throat with the politeness of a man attempting to edit a headline he cannot rewrite. My mother whispered that perhaps this was preliminary and not binding, and something we could smooth over privately, and Jason, deciding offense was the best defense, launched into a speech about entrepreneurial timing and windows that close if you do not lean on them, except his confidence faltered when the next section surfaced, which contained a copy of an email Ryan had sent, on my behalf and with my authorization, to the lender's compliance team the moment the envelope arrived at our building, a letter that revoked any supposed permission, asserted identity theft procedures, and requested a hold on all activity pending verification, while a second attachment confirmed receipt and noted that any future attempt to modify the file would generate a fraud alert sent simultaneously to me and to their law group. An arrangement that would make improvisation extraordinarily inconvenient for anyone hoping to improvise, and my mother, who has always respected official letterhead even when she does not respect my boundaries, went quiet in a way I have only seen twice. Once at a funeral and once when I declined to move home after college because I wanted to know what my life sounded like without her constant narration. Ryan did not raise his voice. He simply kept turning pages with the unhurried patience of someone unspooling a garden hose until it reveals the kink that has been starving the flowers. And out came a text thread from Jason's last landlord confirming that a cosign form emailed from an account with my maiden name had been flagged by their system for mismatched IP data. And then a screenshot of an online form where the emergency contact for a storage unit Jason opened last fall had been listed as me, with a signature that looked like a caricature of my legal name, and then, because the universe enjoys irony, an invoice from a print shop for a run of inspirational mugs with quotes about integrity. The proof sheet annotated in Jason's voice asking if the font could be slightly more serious, a request that would be funny if it did not make me consider the price of dishware as evidence. I felt the old impulse to patch, to translate, to make kind weather, and I let it pass like a tired bird, because the cost of patching is that you become responsible for the whole garment forever, and I am tired of wearing a family coat that never fits. Instead, I turned to my parents and, with a steadiness I gave myself for graduation when nobody else did, told them that I had prepared something for tonight that would help us avoid misunderstandings going forward, then slid out 2 elegant cards from my bag that looked like novelty place settings, but were in fact simple acknowledgments drafted by my quiet lawyer, each stating in kind language that they recognized my income as mine, that they would not make claims on my salary or list my name without written consent, and that if a relative required assistance, we would discuss it in writing with timelines and caps. After which I set a pretty pen next to each card and asked them to sign as a gesture of faith that we could learn a new way of being family where generosity did not require sacrificing the person providing it, and while my mother blinked at the clause about written consent and my father reread the paragraph about caps, Jason scoffed and accused me of turning love into paperwork, which would have stung years ago, except tonight it sounded like the complaint of a man discovering that a free ride expects a ticket. My revenge, which I delivered with the frost of professional courtesy wrapped in velvet, was not fury, not even a threat, but a pivot that made the old system unprofitable. I told the server that we would be paying in 3 groups, my check with Ryan, my parents together if they preferred, and Jason solo, and then, before my mother could object and before Jason could claim his wallet had mysteriously teleported, I handed the server a prepaid gift card I had purchased that afternoon for a precise amount covering my parents' meals and a dessert they would take home, a small kindness that also contained a boundary, because the card came with a printed receipt showing what had been covered and what had not, and as the server nodded and tucked it away, Ryan placed one last page on the table with a gentleness that made me brace, a notarized statement from our building's concierge confirming that the envelope addressed to me had been collected by Jason earlier that week as a favor that now sat under the soft light like a relic from a faith I had finally left, and while my parents stared at the notary seal and Jason finally, truly, lost his grin, Ryan tapped his finger once on the folder as if knocking on a door and said that we had reached the point where options narrowed neatly into 2, and that before dessert arrived he hoped Jason would choose the one that kept the night from ending with sirens. The choice Ryan laid out did not come with thunder or a raised voice, only the plain arithmetic of consequences presented in the same steady cadence he uses when he reads a recipe and already knows how the dish will taste. And as he explained that option 1 involved Jason emailing the lender and the vendor before the end of the night with a clear withdrawal of all applications tied to my name, an apology that admitted misuse without painting it as a misunderstanding, and a signed promise never again to attach my identity to anything without notarized consent, while option 2 involved a police report filed within 24 hours along with the tidy package of exhibits currently warming under the chandelier. My mother began to shape my name like a plea, and my father whispered that families should not air their bruises in public, and Jason, who has never believed in gravity when charisma is available, rolled his eyes and said we were being theatrical, which would have stung if the folder had not transformed the table into a stage where improvisation was finally more expensive than rehearsal. I told Jason that I did not need remorse packaged as poetry, that a quiet set of corrections would do, and that, should he choose the path of paperwork, I would consider, not promise, but consider, holding the report in a drawer long enough for him to rebuild his house without borrowing bricks from mine, and then, because revenge tastes better when it nourishes something rather than just burns it, I took a deep breath and pulled out a final envelope I had carried for weeks like a superstition. A letter I had not intended to use tonight, and I set it down in front of my parents with the gentleness people reserve for heirlooms, explaining that Ryan, while helping me clean our hallway closet last month, had asked why my grandmother's old tin box of documents, saved between cookbooks and a shoebox of ticket stubs, held an unsigned page from a small trust that mentioned a fund for the first grandchild to demonstrate the ability to stand on her own. A phrase that felt at once antiquated and sharp, and how he had encouraged me to write to the executor listed at the bottom, not to claim anything, only to clarify what had happened since the page was drafted the year my grandmother died, and how the executor had replied with a surprise wrapped entirely in sober language. The letter, addressed to me but copied to my parents as former informal advisors to the family when the fund was talked about over Sunday pie, explained that the small education account my grandmother opened had been gradually drained over the years to cover temporary needs associated with Jason's serial detours, that the withdrawals had been authorized informally by my parents without a formal amendment, and that, while the trust had not been large, it had been intended to rest unused until a grandchild finished school without defaulting on loans, secured stable employment, and maintained a clean record free of legal entanglements, at which point the remainder would be offered as a symbolic down payment toward a first home held in the grandchild's name alone. And the letter went on to say that, upon reviewing the pattern of withdrawals in light of the recent attempted fraud notice lodged by my counsel, the executor had exercised the discretion permitted by the trust to reassign the remaining balance and to issue a formal letter of censure to those who had, however earnestly, treated the account like a family piggy bank, and would be transferring the remainder into a new account that required only my signature and would sit beyond the reach of relatives and vendors and emergency inspiration, a sum not life-changing by the standards of television windfalls, but the kind of weight that changes a person's posture when she looks at apartments and calculates what peace might cost per month. My mother's hand went to her necklace, as if the chain could lift her out of the chair. My father closed his eyes in the exact way he did the day I left for college with 2 suitcases and a chipped mug, and Jason sputtered that this was theft dressed as tradition, that I could not honestly take money when I was already fine, and I told him that fine is a word people use when they want the steady one to swallow a storm, that the fund was not intended to make me greedy, but to make me stubborn in the right direction, and that I intended to honor its language by placing it where our future would live rather than where his next pivot hoped to land, which is why Ryan had, with my blessing, already arranged a meeting with a broker to look at a modest place with a kitchen that does not rattle and a door I would lock with relief rather than fear, and that, because I am not cruel even when pushed toward it, I had also asked the executor to carve out a small educational slice for Jason's child, should he have one someday, and to hold that slice beyond reach until a report card arrives with steady marks, a decision that registered on Jason's face as both insult and latitude, which is precisely the moral geometry he has never enjoyed doing. Jason swallowed and chose the path available to people who have run out of synonyms for tomorrow, pulling out his phone with thumbs suddenly clumsy, dictating an email that Ryan and I read over his shoulder for accuracy while my mother alternated between apologizing to the air and demanding that I find my compassion, and my father, to his credit, took the pen I had set beside the acknowledgement card and signed his name with a slow care I have not seen since my childhood, after which my mother, bristling and wounded and, for the first time, quiet, placed her signature beside his, not looking at me but not looking away either, which felt like standing in the doorway of a house where the lights have finally been replaced with bulbs that match. We left the restaurant under a sky that looked newly washed, the air holding that promising coolness of late evening, and in the car Ryan rested his hand on my knee and asked if I felt triumphant, to which I said I felt something less cinematic and more structural, like a building settling into its foundation after years of leaning, and he laughed softly and said that would do, and then I asked a question that had been circling since the folder opened, which was how long he had been quietly collecting proof and whether he had waited because he trusted me to speak first or because he wanted to make sure my decision would be one I owned rather than one I borrowed. And he looked at the road and told me that love, properly practiced, does not rescue as much as it witnesses and prepares, a sentence I will be thinking about for a very long time, especially because part of me wondered whether I had simply traded one set of guardians for another, even if the second set is kinder and wears better suits. That night, after the emails were sent and the confirmations arrived and the fraud hold turned permanent and the folder slid into our locked drawer, I stood in the kitchen and read my grandmother's phrase again, the one about standing on my own. And I realized that standing alone did not mean standing without anyone. It meant standing without surrendering the ground under my feet, and while the phone hummed with messages from my mother that veered between concern and nostalgia and from my father that attempted a joke about dessert, I did not answer, not out of cruelty but because silence, tonight, felt like part of the architecture, and as I turned off the light, I wondered whether the trust had been a test or a blessing or both, whether Jason would keep his promise after the adrenaline faded, whether my parents would ever learn to applaud without taking tickets, and whether I had won or simply finally taken my own side. A question that did not require an answer to let me sleep. Only the knowledge that, when they saw what the file said and understood what the letter meant, their jaws dropped because the old story had lost its narrator, and I was ready, at last, to write the next chapter in a hand they would not be allowed to borrow.